On December 15th, a TV news crew found the killer's clothes discarded by the side of the road on their drive away from Cielo, based on Susan's story as reported in the Times. On the 16th, Bernard Weiss called the LAPD to remind them that his son turned in a gun resembling the one used in the Tate murders. Finally, the police dug the .22 butt line out of the evidence room and turned it over to prosecutors. Ballistics tests confirmed that it was the weapon that beat and shot Wojtek Frykowski and shot Jay Sebring and Stephen Parent. There were numerous legal meanderings in late December. Susan and Patricia formally pled not guilty. Leslie changed attorneys. On the 17th, Manson dismissed Fitzgerald, his public defender, and asked Judge Keene to let him represent himself. Judge Keene told Manson that he was not convinced that he was competent to represent himself, or, in legal jargon, to proceed in pro per, in propria persona, wrote Bugliosi. But Manson wasn't ready to roll over. Your Honor, there is no way I can give up my voice in this matter. If I can't speak in my own defense and converse freely in this courtroom, then it ties my hands behind my back, and if I have no voice, then there is no sense in having a defense. Per Bugliosi, Keene agreed to reconsider Manson's motion on the 22nd. Only later would we learn what was happening behind the scenes. Manson had set up his own communications network. Whenever he heard that an attorney for one of the girls had initiated a move on behalf of his client, which could conceivably run counter to Manson's own defense, within days, that attorney would be removed from the case. Barnett, Van Houten's attorney, had wanted a psychiatrist to examine Leslie. Learning of this, Manson vetoed the idea, and when the psychiatrist appeared at Sybil Brand, Leslie refused to see him. Her request for Barnett's dismissal came immediately after. Manson's goal? To run the entire defense himself. In court as well as out, Charlie intended to retain complete control of the family. Manson wanted to represent himself, he told the court, because lawyers play with people, and I am a person, and I don't want to be played with in this manner. Lawyers were only interested in one thing, publicity, Manson said. He'd seen quite a few of them lately and felt he knew what he was talking about. Any attorney previously associated with the DA's office was not acceptable to him, he added. On December 19th, Manson's face appeared on the cover of Life magazine. The photo, a mugshot, showed him in all his dark-eyed, demonic zaniness. It was actually taken in spring 1968, when the family was arrested in Oxnard, naked by the side of the road, a year and a half before the murders. Dennis Wilson initially downplayed his link to Charlie with police and the grand jury, as did Terry Melcher. When asked if he'd had sexual relations with female members of the family, Melcher showed police a photograph of Candace Bergen. When I've got beauties like these to get in bed with, why would I want to screw any of Manson's clap-ridden, unwashed dogs? Greg Jacobson, however, was forthright during the proceedings, while still working to untether himself to the taint of Manson. He knew that society would indict him and all of Hollywood for any association with creepy Charlie. On Christmas Eve, Manson was approved to represent himself. Prosecutors feared they would lose control of the courtroom, but a worse scenario might have been if Charlie had had a competent attorney who told him he could demand an immediate trial. They would have been screwed if he'd pulled that card. Bugliosi didn't even understand the Helter Skelter motive until late spring. At year-end, Paul Watkins met with investigators in Independence. He couldn't extricate himself from the family entirely. He and non-jailed family members rented a house in Van Nuys to be near where Charlie was jailed. In Manson's absence, Paul was responsible for the family. He carried messages between Charlie and the others in lockup. On the 26th of December, police identified the couple, who found Tex, Susan, Pat, and Linda drinking from their water hose. The man, Rudolph Weber, recalled the license plate number of the car that late night, and it matched that of Johnny Swartz's Ford. Again, if he could remember the plate number 4 months after the fact, he certainly would have remembered it the following morning. Why didn't Mr. Weber call the police then? Susan was receiving visits at Sybil Brand from several family women who tried to get her to recant her grand jury testimony. They reminded her that she had a little boy in protective custody, hoping it would sway her back to their side. I began to receive messages from Charlie through my visitors. He was working on me subtly, trying to bring me back under his domination, trying to get me to deny everything I had said. Vincent Bugliosi had never wanted to offer immunity to Atkins. I made a deal with Richard Caballero, Susan Atkins' lawyer, that if Susan cooperated, I wouldn't seek the death penalty against her. If she stopped cooperating, I couldn't use what she'd told me. I hadn't wanted to do this. As far as I was concerned, she was one of the main killers. Susan wrote, "Though I was supposed to be held incommunicado, Gypsy gets herself arrested and put on my floor of the jail to scream and yell at me for a day and a half. I was a stench. I was dead. Charlie wanted to see me. If I came back, everything would be forgiven. And finally, I was reminded they could still find my son." The prosecutor was searching for motive, trying to understand what led the family to kill and what convincible case he could present. Bugliosi had a perfect prosecutorial record. He'd won every homicide case he tried and had no intention of letting this band of scruffy stabbers blemish his record. Thus, the Bug, as the family nicknamed him, went on the chase for what became known as the magic motive. Even Bugliosi had doubts about whether he could convince a jury of Manson's guilt in the murders. The women and Tex were easier. Susan admitted to her crimes. How she admitted to crimes she didn't commit. There was physical evidence linking Krenwinkel, Watson, and Beausoleil, and Van Houten was implicated by others. But Charlie? He wasn't even there when the killings went down. How could the prosecutor tie him to the murders? That's how Bugliosi stumbled on Helter Skelter. By demonstrating that Manson had a vested interest in Los Angeles going up in flames following the murder of establishment white people pinned on black militants, the prosecutor found something tangible that, as outlandish as it was, a jury would believe. But as Susan wrote, Bugliosi didn't look at the events that led up to these murders in chronological order. If you don't study what happened in the order it happened, how can you ever understand why one occurrence followed another? The Tate LaBianca trial was rushed from the start due to the incredible amount of public pressure the Los Angeles Police Department was under. The grand jury was held before the district attorney's office had any real evidence on anyone except for my testimony. As such, Mr. Bugliosi was forced into the case much quicker than he would have liked. He had to come up with a way to convict Charles Manson of crimes which Mr. Bugliosi knew he was responsible for, but for which Charles Manson had been very careful to distance himself from. It wasn't until the trial started that Vincent Bugliosi finally found out about the suspected murder of Bernard Crowe. By the time Vincent Bugliosi discovered it, he was already selling Helter Skelter to a jury. To have tried to change the purported motive at that point would have cost him his credibility in a case in which he was already stretching his credibility to the limit. What might have happened if there hadn't been such a speedy demand for justice was that the killers could have been tried as follows. Trial 1. Bobby, Mary, Susan, and Charlie for Hinman's murder, outlining Manson's control and his role in attempting to extort money from Hinman. Bruce Davis and Danny DiCarlo, accessories to the crime, could have been compelled to testify in exchange for immunity, as would Susan and Mary. Charlie's bloody assault on Gary with the cutlass sword ultimately led to his murder by Beausoleil, who was scared that Hinman would go to police, and then Charlie would have gone after Bobby for letting him be at risk of arrest and imprisonment. Bobby would have gotten a death sentence for stabbing Gary, and Manson would have faced a second-degree murder conviction. Trial 2. Watson, Susan, and Patricia for Cielo Drive. Without Manson in the courtroom, witnesses like Paul Watkins, Barbara Hoyt, and Linda Kasabian would have felt safer, and perhaps Tex and Katie could have been compelled to testify. Susan would still have been bound to her prosecution deal, perhaps found guilty of second-degree murder, while Watson and Krenwinkel would likely have received death sentences. Manson would have been implicated as the master manipulator who ordered the killings, while still demonstrating free will for each defendant. Sadly, it also meant that this trial would likely not have begun until late 1970. That's because Watson fought extradition successfully for nearly a year. Trial 3. Then Charlie, Tex, Patricia, and Leslie could have been tried for Waverly Drive. Manson, having committed armed entry and robbery at Waverly, and ordering Watson, Krenwinkel, and Van Houten, in the presence of witnesses, to commit the murders, would have been tried with the others even though he didn't stay for the killings. Further testimony about Helter Skelter would have been presented to explain why the killers were ordered to make this scene even more horrifying than Cielo Drive the night before. That is ostensibly why the LaBiancas were killed. Today, this would also result in terrorism charges. Manson literally tried to instigate revenge killings in a major U.S. city. Tex would have again faced a death sentence. Pat and Leslie would have received life sentences, and Charlie would have been found guilty of second-degree murder. A reminder that when a homicide takes place during the commission of a crime, all perpetrators face a charge of murder. Because Charlie broke into the LaBianca home and stole Rosemary's wallet and tied both her and Leno up for the killers, he too would have faced a murder rap. Then, Trial 4. Charlie, Tex, Bruce, Grogan, and whoever else took part would then have been tried for Shorty's killing. Finally, after these cases were tried, and Charlie receiving likely several second-degree murder charges and a sentence of many years to life, the LA prosecutor's office could then have tried Manson separately for conspiracy at Cielo Drive, using witness statements from the earlier trial of Watson, Atkins, and Krenwinkel. The rumor that Charlie went to the residence after the murders and tampered with evidence might have come out. For this, he likely would have received a sentence of life without the possibility of parole. But the LAPD was hounded daily by taxpayers and pushing the district attorney to get to trial immediately. The events of August 9th and 10th were so demented, so sickening, and so influential on the public psyche. Nobody could rest safe, they believed, until the murderers were convicted. That rush to trial resulted in the deserved convictions of the killers, but it created a false narrative we are still unraveling 50 years later. Trying those accused at both the Cielo Drive and Waverly Drive homes also resulted in the LaBiancas being overshadowed by movie star Sharon Tate and her glamorous friends. The truth was that there were different motives for the second night than for the first, and different killers. Plus, if the killers of the LaBiancas were tried separately, the prosecution could have revealed Manson as the bumbling, failed crime lord that he was, who resorted to fanciful stories to get his followers to kill. It would have debunked any idea that Manson had superpowers. Trying the Cielo case before the Waverly case would also have proven Watson equally as controlling and dangerous as Charlie. Literally every one of the victims, save Gary Hinman, was killed wholly or in part by Tex Watson. Every single one. Tex is the primary killer in the Manson family. Tex Watson inflicted a whopping total of at least 6 fatal gunshots, personally inflicted at least 100 stab wounds, battered and strung up Jay Sebring, and battered, stabbed, and shot Wojtek Frykowski. Tex fatally stabbed Abigail Folger, Sharon Tate, and both of the LaBiancas. Charles Manson wasn't a serial or even spree killer, but Tex Watson is. Instead of the public believing that Charlie was a magical Pied Piper who turned the children of America into murderous zombies, we would have seen him for what he really was: a psychopath, a clown, and seen Watson as the criminal who truly embraced and embodied evil. Had the cases been tried as listed above, the prosecutors would also have come closer to the real motives. But money woes, bungling drug deals, and vengeance are as salacious and juicy as Helter Skelter. An apocalyptic race war trumped the truth clearly.